Here is something that nobody who benefits from your confusion will ever say plainly. Money does not flow toward effort. It flows toward leverage. It does not reward fairness. It rewards position. And the difference between the person who works themselves into exhaustion every decade of their life and the person who builds wealth in the same period is not intelligence, not starting conditions, not luck, although luck plays a role in everything. It is the understanding of a specific set of principles that govern how resources move in the world. These principles are not taught in schools, because schools were not designed to produce people who understand how power operates. They were designed to produce people who are useful to people who already understand how power operates. They are not discussed openly in the circles where they are practiced, because the advantage they produce is precisely the advantage of the other person not knowing them. And they are uncomfortable, because they describe the world as it actually functions, rather than as we would prefer it to function. Machiavelli did not invent these principles. He observed them, documented them with unusual honesty, and refused to soften his description of them out of deference to the moral preferences of his audience. He understood that a description of the world as it should be is far less useful than a description of the world as it is. And the world as it is runs on 9 laws that most people will spend their entire lives inside without ever naming. The first law is the one that governs every room where resources are being allocated, every negotiation where something real is at stake, every relationship where power is being established or contested. Silence is not the absence of power. It is one of its purest expressions. Consider what happens in any high-stakes interaction when someone needs to prove their worth. They talk. They explain. They fill silence with justification, with the narration of their value, with the implicit plea for recognition that every unnecessary word contains. They talk because silence makes them uncomfortable, because they have confused the absence of speech with the absence of significance, because they cannot tolerate the pressure of an unresolved moment and believe that words will resolve it. What they do not understand is that the person across from them, if that person understands the game being played, is watching the talking as data. Every word beyond what is necessary is a piece of information about the speaker's anxiety. Every explanation that was not requested reveals a need for approval that can be exploited. Every attempt to fill silence confirms that the speaker cannot sit in it, which tells the listener everything about the speaker's tolerance for pressure. The person who can sit in silence, not perform silence but genuinely occupy it without anxiety, is communicating something that words cannot. They are communicating that the silence does not threaten them, that they do not need the other person to fill it, that they are comfortable in a space of unresolved tension because they do not require external resolution to feel intact. This is the behavioral signature of someone who is not desperate for the outcome. And the person who is not desperate for the outcome is the person who controls the negotiation. In every setting where something of value is being decided, the person who talks first reveals the limits of their patience. The person who asks too many questions reveals the shape of their uncertainty. The person who jokes when the room is tense reveals that they cannot tolerate the tension. And the person who sits quietly, observing, waiting, saying only what is necessary and nothing more, has imposed a form of authority on the room that does not announce itself and cannot be argued with. Stop talking to prove. Start talking to end speculation. And between those moments, let the silence work. The second law governs the territory that silence alone cannot protect. Emotional legibility is a vulnerability that the world will exploit if you allow it. When you are readable, when your anxiety shows in your voice, when your frustration shows in your face, when your need shows in your eagerness, you have given the people around you a map of your interior. And people with resources to allocate or withhold will use that map. Not always consciously, not always with malice, but consistently. Because the readable person is the predictable person, and the predictable person can be managed. The salesperson who reads your hesitation will introduce the tactic that addresses it. The employer who reads your financial desperation will offer less than they would offer someone who seemed indifferent to the outcome. The negotiating partner who reads your eagerness to close will slow down, because they know time is working against you more than against them. This is not predatory behavior in any unusual sense. It is the basic operation of any interaction where one party has information the other does not, and that information is the emotional state of the person across from them. The practice that addresses this is not the suppression of emotion. Suppression is different from control, and the difference shows. Suppression produces a specific kind of tightness, in the jaw, in the shoulders, in the slightly overmanaged quality of every expression, that is as legible to an experienced observer as the original emotion would have been. Control is different. Control is the genuine internal process of having metabolized the emotion before the interaction, of having already made peace with the worst plausible outcome, of being present in the room without any significant portion of your attention devoted to managing how you appear. The person who has done that internal work is genuinely calm. And genuine calm is not a technique. It is the consequence of preparation. Know what you are willing to walk away from before you walk in. Know what you actually need versus what you would prefer. Know the floor beneath your position. And then sit on your floor without showing anyone where it is. The third law concerns the relationship between time and power, and it is the one that is most consistently misunderstood by people who have been told that speed is a virtue. Patience is not passivity. It is the strategic accumulation of advantage while others exhaust themselves in premature action. The pattern is consistent across every domain where resources are competed for. The person who acts from anxiety, from the fear that the opportunity will close, that someone else will move first, that waiting will cost them something, acts before the information available justifies the action. They move when conditions are good enough, rather than when conditions are right. And good enough, compounded over a lifetime of decisions made from anxiety rather than calculation, produces outcomes that are consistently below what discipline would have generated. The person who acts from calculation, from genuine assessment of timing, rather than from the pressure of impatience, waits. Not indefinitely, not from avoidance, but with the specific intention of acting only when the asymmetry of the situation is clearly in their favor. When fear has driven others out of the market, when the crisis has separated the distressed sellers from the patient buyers, when the room has shown enough of its cards that the move carries genuine confidence rather than hope. Machiavelli made a distinction that cuts to the center of this. The wise person does at once what the foolish person does eventually. This is not a contradiction of patience. It is its completion. The patient person does not act slowly. They wait slowly, and then act immediately when the moment arrives. The gap between waiting and moving is not hesitation. It is precision. And precision requires having already decided, during the waiting period, exactly what conditions would justify action, so that when those conditions arrive, the action is immediate and complete. The fourth law is the one that most directly explains why individual effort, no matter how sustained, has a structural ceiling that strategy does not. Leverage is the replacement of linear effort with exponential positioning. You have 24 hours in a day. If you trade those hours directly for income, your income is capped by the number of hours you can sell and the rate at which they can be sold. These are both finite. The ceiling is real and relatively low. The person who works 12 hours a day at twice the market rate still produces less income than the person who has positioned 5 other people's 12 hours to flow through a structure they own. This is not exploitation in any meaningful moral sense. It is the basic difference between labor and architecture. The laborer works in the system. The architect designs the system. Both are necessary, but the returns are not comparable, because the architect's design keeps producing after the architect stops working, while the laborer's income stops the moment the laborer stops working. The question to ask about every significant commitment of your time and energy is not, how much will this produce while I am working on it? It is, what structure will this build? And how will that structure produce after I am no longer actively involved? The answer to that question determines whether your effort is building a job or building a system. And systems, once built, operate independently of the continuous input of the person who built them. The fifth law addresses the dimension of wealth creation that most people in practical, rational-minded frameworks dismiss at their significant cost. Narrative is not secondary to value. In most markets, narrative precedes and creates value. Machiavelli observed that men are driven more by imagination than by reason. This was not an insult to the intelligence of the people he was describing. It was an accurate observation about how human decision-making actually works. The rational assessment of a product's intrinsic qualities is almost never what drives the decision to purchase it, to invest in it, to tell others about it. What drives those decisions is the meaning that has been constructed around the product, the identity it allows the buyer to claim, the aspiration it represents, the story it places the buyer inside. Apple does not sell devices. It sells a story about the kind of person who uses Apple products. Luxury goods do not sell quality, which is often indistinguishable from less expensive alternatives in blind tests. They sell the specific social signal that the display of their logo broadcasts. The most commercially successful entities in every category are not the ones that produce the best product. They are the ones that constructed the most compelling story around a product that was good enough. This means that if you have something of genuine value and no one is paying for it, the deficit is almost certainly not in the value. It is in the story around the value. And the construction of that story, the deliberate, strategic shaping of how your capability is perceived before anyone has evaluated it directly, is not dishonesty. It is the act of translation between what you actually have and what other people can understand about what you have. The sixth law is the operational complement to the fifth. Substitution is the replacement of your own continuous effort with structures, systems, and other people's effort flowing through positions you have built. The distinction between the person who works and the person who builds is not primarily about intelligence. It is about orientation. The worker asks, "How do I do this better?" The builder asks, "How do I create the conditions in which this gets done without requiring my continuous presence?" The worker's income is a function of their activity. The builder's income is a function of their design. Every hour you spend doing something that someone else could do, at any cost, is an hour not spent designing the structure that would free you from needing to do it. This is not an argument for delegating everything immediately. It is an argument for the continuous question, what am I doing right now that is the highest and most unreplicable use of my specific capability? And what am I doing that represents the displacement of that highest use by something that could be done by a system, a tool, or another person? The answer to that question, pursued consistently, produces a progressive liberation of your most valuable capacity from the tasks that consume it without leveraging it. The seventh law operates in the space between what things are and what they appear to be, which, in most markets, is the space where most of the value lives. Perception is not the shadow of value. In most human contexts, perception is the value. Consider the diamond. Its physical properties are largely unremarkable, among gemstones of similar hardness and refractive quality. Its scarcity is manufactured through the deliberate restriction of supply by entities that control enormous reserves. Its association with love, commitment, and significance is the product of one of the most successful marketing campaigns in commercial history, a campaign conducted through film, advertising, and the shaping of social expectations so complete that most people cannot now distinguish their genuine preference from the preference that was installed in them by that campaign. This is not an argument that diamonds are worthless. It is an observation that their value is almost entirely constructed from perception, and that the construction of that perception was a deliberate act by people who understood that managing perception at scale is the most profitable enterprise available to anyone who can do it. The truth of a thing's intrinsic quality is almost always insufficient to move markets. The story told about that thing, constructed well and distributed to the right audience, moves markets. And the person who understands this is not deceiving anyone. They are operating in the actual world rather than the theoretical one. The eighth law is the one that requires the most careful handling, because it describes something real about how power operates, and can most easily be misread as a license for predation. It is not designed to be. Awareness of weakness, in markets, in timing, in human psychology, is not the same as the exploitation of individual people. It is the recognition that every situation contains asymmetric opportunities that are visible only to the person paying attention. When markets collapse in panic, prices disconnect from underlying value. This disconnection is an opportunity that is available to anyone who has the liquidity and the calm to purchase what others are selling from fear. This is not the exploitation of the sellers in any meaningful moral sense. It is the basic operation of a functioning market, where prices are set by the intersection of willing buyers and willing sellers. The seller who sells from panic would prefer not to be panicking, but they are panicking, and the calm buyer who takes the other side of that transaction is not causing the panic. They are simply awake to it. The broader principle is that every moment of widespread irrationality, of collective fear, of mass enthusiasm, of the cognitive distortions that affect large groups under pressure, creates asymmetric situations for the person who has maintained rationality. This is not cruelty. It is the practical application of calm in an environment where calm is rare. And the person who has developed the internal discipline to maintain calm under pressure will consistently encounter opportunities that are invisible to the majority, precisely because the majority is too anxious to see them. The ninth law is the completion of the first. It governs the strategic management of information about yourself, what you reveal, to whom, and when, as the final instrument of sustained power. Every piece of information about your position, your needs, your fears, your limits, your plans, every piece of information that someone else possesses about you is a piece of potential leverage they hold over you. Not because people are uniformly predatory, but because information about your vulnerabilities naturally informs how people engage with you, whether or not that engagement is consciously adversarial. The employer who knows you desperately need the job will offer less. The seller who knows you must have the house will hold firm on price. The partner who knows which arguments you cannot withstand will use those arguments. The management of this is not paranoia. It is the recognition that in any interaction where something of value is being decided, the allocation of information is itself a strategic act. You reveal what advances your position. You protect what would compromise it. You let curiosity exist where full disclosure would eliminate the advantage that curiosity gives you. And you understand that the impulse to be fully known, to share everything, to be transparent, to be authentic in the complete and indiscriminate sense, is an impulse that serves the people receiving the information far more than it serves you. Mystery, in the strategic sense, is not the absence of depth, it is the management of depth, the decision about which parts of your interior are public property and which remain yours. The person who is fully mapped is the person who can be fully managed. The person who retains some genuine unknowability retains the power that comes from being, at least in part, unpredictable. And unpredictability, as every practitioner of power has understood from Machiavelli forward, is one of the conditions under which genuine authority becomes possible. These 9 laws do not describe a world that is fair. They describe a world that is. The question of whether the world should work differently is a legitimate philosophical question, but it is separate from the question of how to operate effectively inside the world as it currently functions. Machiavelli's contribution was not to celebrate the mechanisms of power. It was to describe them honestly enough that the person who read his work could engage with those mechanisms with open eyes, rather than comfortable illusions. Open eyes are not cynicism. They are the prerequisite for genuine effectiveness. And genuine effectiveness is the only path from the position where you are to the position where you could be.